$155 million for one answer, Daniel Alhassan said, his voice smooth as the amber light reflected off his Swiss watch, and the entire table leaned in as if money itself had just spoken. No one questioned him. They never did. Not in a room like this, not under crystal chandeliers and quiet jazz where every glass cost more than a week's salary. But Emily Carter didn't look impressed. She stood beside the table in a simple black uniform, pen resting lightly between her fingers, eyes calm, almost distant, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Daniel slid the folded napkin toward her, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Solve it," he added, almost lazily, like a man tossing crumbs to see who would scramble. A few guests chuckled. Someone whispered, "He does this all the time," and Emily finally looked down just once, her gaze moving across the ink like a quiet current. Then she shifted her attention, not to the numbers, but to the table, the placement of the glass, the angle of his receipt, the faint reflection in his watch face. Everything was information. Everything was part of the question he thought he was asking. Daniel leaned back, confident, already bored, expecting confusion, hesitation, maybe even embarrassment, but Emily didn't react. She reached forward, adjusted the receipt by less than an inch, and set his coffee cup down exactly where it hadn't been before. The movement was so small no one noticed, except him. His eyes flickered, just slightly. "You're asking the wrong question," she said quietly, and the laughter stopped, not abruptly, but like a fading echo that suddenly realized it didn't belong. Daniel tilted his head, intrigued now, the game shifting in a way he hadn't planned. "Then answer the right one," he replied, his tone still controlled but sharper. Watching her more carefully this time, Emily didn't rush, didn't explain. She simply pointed once, a single tap against the paper, and stepped back. Silence followed, not confusion, not yet, just a pause like the room itself was catching up. Then someone leaned in, closer, eyes narrowing, lips parting, and in the span of 3 seconds, the energy changed completely. Daniel's smile didn't fade. It froze, held in place by something heavier than surprise. His fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to feel real, because what she had done wasn't just solving a puzzle. It was exposing the flaw inside it. The flaw he didn't see because he never had to look that closely, never had to question the premise. The room shifted, attention no longer orbiting him, but her and Emily already. Turning away, didn't look back, didn't wait for applause, didn't acknowledge the weight of what she'd just done. She simply walked, leaving behind the napkin, the number, and a silence that felt more expensive than anything he'd ever offered. Daniel did not move for a full 5 seconds after she disappeared into the soft blur of tables and shadows, his eyes still fixed on the napkin, as if it might rewrite itself under pressure. But it did not. The answer remained there, simple, precise, undeniable. And for the first time that evening, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not even embarrassment, but a quiet disruption, like a crack in a system that had always worked exactly as expected. "Check it again," one of his associates murmured, leaning closer, but Daniel had already checked it twice. The logic was clean, the flaw obvious now, almost embarrassingly so. And that was what unsettled him the most. Not that she solved it, but that she saw it immediately, without effort, without performance, without needing the room to notice. He leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, his fingers brushing the edge of his watch as if grounding himself in something familiar, something controlled. But the control had shifted, subtly, irreversibly, across the room. Emily moved between tables with the same quiet rhythm as before, taking orders, refilling glasses, nodding politely, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just dismantled a challenge that had entertained him for months. He watched her now, not casually, not dismissively, but with focus, tracking the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she noticed small details, the way she never rushed, even when others expected her to. "Who is she?" he asked finally, his voice lower, more measured. One of the men shrugged. "Just a server, I think," but Daniel did not look convinced because there was nothing just about what he had just witnessed. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a card, then paused, reconsidered, That was his usual move, efficient, transactional, predictable, and something about her made that feel insufficient. He stood instead, the subtle shift drawing a few glances, not because standing was unusual, but because he rarely did anything without intention. And this had intention. He crossed the floor at an unhurried pace, each step deliberate, until he reached the station where Emily was placing down a tray. She sensed him before he spoke. Her posture did not change, but her eyes lifted slightly, acknowledging his presence without yielding to it. "You adjusted the premise," he said, not as a question, but as a realization spoken out loud. Emily wiped her hands gently on a cloth, then looked at him fully calm, steady. "No," she replied. "I just noticed it was wrong." The answer landed with more weight than volume. Daniel studied her face, searching for something, arrogance, pride, even a hint of satisfaction. But there was none, only clarity, and that unsettled him more than any clever response could have. "Most people try to solve what they are given," he said slowly. "You did not." Emily tilted her head, just slightly. "Most people assume what they are given is correct," she said, then picked up the tray again, as if the conversation had already reached its natural end. Daniel felt the shift again, that quiet reversal, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. He'd spent years building a world where he asked the questions and others chased the answers. And now, standing in the middle of a restaurant, he realized that someone had just rewritten the rules without asking for permission. "Emily," he said, reading her name from the small tag on her uniform, testing it, grounding it. "Where did you learn to see like that?" She paused just for a moment, then gave the smallest hint of smile, not warm, not cold, just distant, the same place you learned not to, she said softly, and then she walked away again, leaving him with a question he could not solve as easily as the last one. The music had not changed. The glasses still clinked. The low conversations resumed as if nothing significant had happened. But Daniel knew better. Something had shifted beneath the surface, something quiet but permanent. He returned to his table slowly, not because he needed to, but because he needed to think. His associates watched him with curiosity. They tried to hide, waiting for a reaction, a joke, a dismissal, anything that would restore the familiar balance. But Daniel said nothing. He sat down, picked up the napkin again, and this time he did not look at the answer. He looked at the question, really looked at it, tracing the structure, the assumptions, the hidden flaw that now seemed impossible to miss. And yet he had missed it, not because it was complex, but because it was simple, too simple for the way he was used to thinking. He had been trained to see layers, to expect traps, to overanalyze. And in doing so, he had overlooked the one thing that mattered, the premise itself. He exhaled slowly, placing the napkin down with care, as if it were something fragile. She saw it immediately. One of the men said quietly, still trying to process it. Daniel nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then his gaze drifted across the room again, finding her without effort. Emily moved with the same calm precision, balancing a tray, adjusting a chair, listening to a customer with polite focus. Nothing about her demanded attention, and yet now, all of his attention was there. He noticed things he had not seen before, the way she paused for half a second before responding, as if filtering out unnecessary noise, the way her eyes moved, not randomly, but deliberately, mapping the environment, the way she never seemed rushed. Even when the pace around her accelerated, it was not confidence, not exactly. It was something deeper, something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself. And that was what unsettled him most, because it could not be bought, could not be influenced, could not be predicted. "You were overthinking." This, another voice said, attempting to lighten the moment. "It was just a lucky guess." Daniel did not respond right away. He let the words settle, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said, his tone even controlled. "Luck does not correct structure." The table fell silent again, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no defensiveness, no ego, just clarity, and that was new. He reached for his glass, took a slow sip, then set it down with intention, his mind already moving forward, not to reclaim control, but to understand it. He had built his entire life on identifying value before others saw it, on recognizing patterns before they became obvious, and now, standing in front of him, disguised in a uniform no one respected, was a pattern he had almost ignored, almost dismissed, and that realization did not sit well with him. Across the room, Emily finished placing an order and turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for just a fraction of a second. Not challenging, not inviting, simply aware, and in that brief exchange, Daniel understood something he had not understood before. She was not reacting to him. She was not impressed by him. She was not playing his game. She was operating on a completely different set of rules. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself outside the system he controlled, looking in, trying to understand how it worked. He leaned back in his chair, the faint ticking of his watch suddenly louder than before, and allowed himself a rare, quiet thought. Not about money, not about power, but about perspective, because somewhere between the question he had asked and the answer she had given, something had changed, and he was no longer certain that he was the one who understood the game best. Daniel did not leave when the meeting ended. Even as chairs shifted and quiet goodbyes filled the air, he remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his fingers resting lightly on the table as if holding on to something invisible. Then he stood, not with urgency, but with intention, his eyes already searching, not for attention, not for recognition, but for her. He found Emily near the far end of the room, clearing a table that had already forgotten the people who once sat there. Her movements steady, efficient, unaffected by the presence of someone like him approaching again. Most people would notice, would adjust, would react, but she did not. And that alone told him more than any answer she could give. "You changed the outcome without changing the numbers," he said as he stopped beside her, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance. Emily did not look up immediately. She finished aligning the utensils, wiped the edge of the table once more, then met his gaze, calm as before. "The numbers were never the problem," she replied, her tone even, almost indifferent. Daniel studied her again, this time not searching for weakness, but for structure, the same way he would analyze a system worth millions, because that was what this felt like now. Not a conversation, but a system he did not fully understand. "Then what was?" he asked, and for the first time, there was no challenge in his voice, only curiosity, real curiosity, the kind that did not demand an answer. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him for a brief second, as if deciding how much to say. "Assumptions," she said simply, then turned to pick up a glass, the word hanging in the space between them longer than it should have. Daniel repeated it silently, not because he did not understand the word, but because he was realizing how often he relied on it without noticing. Assumptions about people, about roles, about who was worth listening to and who was not. He had built efficiency on top of them, speed, control, results, but now, standing here, he saw the cost, the blind spots they created, the things he never questioned because he never had to. "You assumed I was wrong," he said after a moment, not accusing, just stating. Emily shook her head slightly. "No," she corrected, "I assumed you did not check." And that landed differently, sharper, more precise, because it was not about intelligence. It was about attention, about the willingness to look closer when everyone else stops. Daniel let out a quiet breath, something almost like a laugh, but without humor. Most people would have tried to impress me, he said, almost to himself. Emily gave a small shrug, not dismissive, just honest. "Most people think that matters," she replied, then placed the glass on her tray, her movements unchanged, as if this entire exchange carried no weight for her. But for him, it carried more than he expected, because for the first time in a long time, someone had not tried to win his approval, had not tried to benefit from his presence, had not even acknowledged his status as something meaningful. And that absence of reaction revealed something he had not noticed before, how much of his world depended on people reacting to him, adjusting for him, orbiting around him, and how different it felt when someone did not. "You could have taken the offer," he said, the number unspoken but understood. Emily paused just slightly, then looked at him again, her expression unchanged. "I solved the problem," she said. "That was enough." And with that, she turned away once more, moving toward the next table, leaving Daniel standing there, not dismissed, not rejected, but something else entirely, something quieter, something harder to define, because for the first time, he was not the one deciding the value of the moment. And as he stood there, Watching her disappear into the rhythm of the room again, he realized that the question he had asked earlier was no longer the one that mattered. And the answer he needed was not written on a napkin, but somewhere in the way she saw the world. Differently than he ever had, Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer after she walked away. Not because he did not know what to do next, but because for the first time in years, he was not sure what the right move was. The room around him continued, as if nothing had shifted, but he could feel it, subtle, persistent, like a question that refused to be ignored. He turned slowly and walked back to his table. His steps measured, his expression composed, but his mind no longer moving in straight lines. He sat down, glanced once more at the napkin, then folded it carefully and placed it into his jacket pocket, not as a reminder of failure, but as a marker, something that told him this moment mattered. More than it appeared. Across from him, one of his associates leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You are not seriously letting this go," he said, half amused, half uncertain. Daniel looked up, his gaze steady. "I'm not letting anything go," he replied, and there was something different in his tone. Not defensive, not dismissive, just certain in a quieter way. The man leaned back, unsure how to respond, because this was not the reaction he expected. It was not the reaction anyone expected. Daniel had built a reputation on control, on clarity, on always being the one who understood the situation faster than anyone else. And yet tonight, he had missed something simple, something obvious, something standing right in front of him. And instead of correcting it with authority, he found himself wanting to understand it. He stood again, this time without hesitation, and moved toward the manager's station. The man behind it straightened immediately, recognizing him, already prepared to accommodate whatever request was about to be made. "Sir, is everything satisfactory?" the manager asked with a practiced smile. Daniel nodded once, then gestured subtly toward the floor. "The server," he said, not using her name this time. "Not needing to." "Emily," the manager replied quickly. "Yes, she is one of our most reliable staff members." Daniel studied the man for a brief second, measuring the response. "Where did she come from?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying weight. The manager hesitated, just slightly, then adjusted his tone. "She has been with us for about a year, keeps to herself, does her job well, no complaints." Daniel nodded again, absorbing the information, but it was not enough. It explained nothing about what he had seen, nothing about the way she thought, the way she noticed, the way she moved through a problem without announcing it. And before that, he asked, and now there was a subtle shift, not pressure, but expectation. The manager paused. Longer this time, searching for an answer he clearly did not have. "I am not sure," he admitted. "She did not say much during hiring." Daniel held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod. Not disappointed, just confirming what he already suspected. She had chosen this position, not fallen into it. And that distinction changed everything. He turned away without another word, returning to the main floor, his attention already recalibrating, no longer scanning the room for opportunities, but for understanding. Across the space, Emily was taking an order from a couple seated near the window. Her posture relaxed, her voice calm, her presence unchanged, as if none of this had touched her world at all. And that contrast between the impact she had created and the way she carried herself afterward told him more than anything else could. She was not performing, not revealing, not even reacting. She was simply being, and in that simplicity, there was a level of control he had not encountered before. Daniel stopped a few steps away, not interrupting, not inserting himself into the moment, just observing, really observing, the kind of attention he usually reserved for high-stakes decisions, because somewhere beneath the surface of this quiet routine was a pattern he had not yet fully seen. And he knew now, more than ever, that until he understood it, the question would remain unanswered, not on paper, but in the way he saw everything that came after the night move forward. But Daniel did not feel time the same way anymore. Each second carried weight now, not because of pressure, but because of awareness. He stood near the edge of the room, no longer the center of it. And for once, he did not try to reclaim that position. Instead, he watched, not passively, but with intent, the kind of focus he once reserved for negotiations worth hundreds of millions. Except now, The subject was a single person who seemed to exist completely outside his usual calculations. Emily finished serving the table by the window and turned toward the service station, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged. She moved like someone who understood exactly what mattered and ignored everything else, and that precision, that quiet filtering of the world began to reveal a pattern, not in what she did, but in what she did not do. She did not rush to please, did not seek approval, did not adjust her tone based on who was in front of her. And yet, no one complained, no one felt neglected, because she gave exactly what was needed. No more, no less. Daniel stepped closer, not interrupting, just entering her space with a different energy than before. Less authority, more presence. She noticed him immediately, not surprised, just aware. "You are still here," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation. Daniel nodded once. "I am," he replied, then paused, not out of hesitation, but because he was choosing his words carefully, something he rarely had to do. "I've spent years solving problems people could not even define," he said slowly. "But tonight I missed something simple." Emily set down a glass, aligning it with the others, her fingers steady. "Simple does not mean obvious," she said, her voice calm. Daniel considered that, letting it settle, then shifted slightly, his gaze steady, but no longer imposing. "You saw it because you were not trying to prove anything," he said, and this time, it was not a statement of analysis, but recognition. Emily gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "When you try to prove something," she replied, "you stop seeing what is already there." The words were quiet, but they carried a clarity that cut deeper than any argument. Daniel exhaled softly, a subtle release of something he had been holding without realizing it. Because that was exactly what he had been doing, proving, constantly, to investors, to competitors, to himself. And in that constant need to validate his position, he had stopped questioning the foundation beneath it. He glanced around the room, seeing it differently now. Not as a space he controlled, but as a system of small details, each one holding information he would have ignored before. The angle of a chair, the hesitation in a voice, the way attention shifted when something unexpected happened. All signals, all data, all overlooked. "You do not react to any of this," he said, gesturing lightly to the room. "The noise, the expectations." Emily followed his glance briefly, then looked back at him. "It is not noise if you know what to listen for," she said. And there was again that difference, not in intelligence, but in attention, in where it was placed and how it was used. Daniel felt something shift again, deeper this time, not just in how he saw her, but in how he saw himself, because for the first time he was not the one ahead of the pattern, he was inside it, trying to understand it from a position he was not used to. And instead of resisting that, he allowed it, just for a moment. "Most people would have taken the money," he said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a reflection. Emily picked up her tray, her movements smooth, deliberate. "Most people are solving for the wrong thing," she replied, and without waiting for his response, she stepped past him, returning to the rhythm of the room, leaving Daniel standing there once again, not dismissed, not ignored, but placed somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere between knowing and learning. And for the first time in a long time, he did not try to move out of that space. He stayed in it, because he was beginning to understand that the answer he was looking for was not something he could demand, but something he had to learn to see. Daniel did not return to his table again, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he had realized that saying more would not give him what he was looking for. The room continued to move around him, conversations rising and falling, glasses refilled, plates cleared, but his attention stayed fixed on a different rhythm now, one that did not follow status or volume, but precision. Emily moved through the space again, her path not random, not reactive, but intentional in a way that was almost invisible unless someone chose to see it. And now he was choosing to see it. She paused briefly at a table before a guest even raised their hand. She adjusted a chair before someone noticed it was misaligned. She answered a question before it was fully asked, not by guessing, but by observing, by collecting details most people ignored. Daniel stepped closer once more, not interrupting her work, but positioning himself where he could understand it, really understand it. She noticed him again, as she always did, but this time she did not speak first. She waited, giving him space to arrive at his own words. You anticipate everything, he said finally, his voice quieter than it had been all night. Not testing, not proving, just recognizing. Emily considered that for a moment, then shook her head slightly. No, she said, I just pay attention before it becomes urgent. And that distinction landed with clarity, because urgency was the world he knew, deals closing, decisions made under pressure, reactions measured in seconds. But she was operating before that. Before urgency existed, in the space where problems were still patterns, not crises. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, then glanced briefly toward the napkin in his pocket, a reminder that what seemed complex was often just overlooked simplicity. You could do more than this, he said, not as a judgment, but as a statement shaped by his own world. Emily picked up a tray, balancing it with ease. More than what? She asked calmly. Daniel gestured lightly around them. This, he said, meaning the restaurant, the uniform, the role everyone assumed defined her. Emily followed his gesture for a brief second, then looked back at him, her expression unchanged. This is what I am doing right now, she replied, and there was no defensiveness in it, no justification, just presence. Daniel paused, realizing that he had framed the question incorrectly again, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he was still measuring value through a lens that did not apply to her. Corrected himself slightly. With how you think, Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not amused, not dismissive, just aware. Thinking is not the same as chasing, she said, and that stopped him because chasing was exactly what his entire world was built on. Growth, expansion, acquisition, always forward, always more. And for the first time, he questioned it, not as a flaw, but as a limitation, because what if seeing clearly required stillness, not motion, attention, not speed. He watched her as she moved again, seamless, composed, unaffected by the weight of the conversation. And in that moment, he understood something he had not understood before. She was not underutilized, she was intentional. She had chosen this space, this pace, this perspective, and that choice carried a level of control he had never considered, one that did not depend on power or wealth, but on clarity. You do not seem interested in changing anything, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Emily paused just long enough to respond. I change what needs to be changed, she said, then continued on, leaving him with that again. The precision, the restraint, the absence of excess. Daniel stood there, the noise of the room fading slightly in his awareness, because for the first time, he was not trying to dominate the situation, he was trying to understand it. And as he slipped his hand into his jacket, feeling the folded napkin still there, he realized that the number written on it no longer mattered. What mattered was what it had revealed, not about her, but about him, about the way he saw the world, the assumptions he carried without question, and the quiet realization that perhaps the most valuable thing he had encountered that night was not something he could offer a price for, but something he had to learn to recognize. And that was a kind of problem he had never solved before the night had thinned into something quieter, the crowd no longer chasing attention, but settling into smaller conversations, softer tones. And in that shift, the room revealed details it had hidden before. Daniel noticed it immediately, the way the space breathed differently when it was no longer trying to impress anyone. And in that calmer rhythm, Emily seemed even more aligned. As if this was the pace she had been waiting for all along, she moved with the same precision. But now it was easier to see the intention behind every step, every pause, every glance. Daniel remained where he was, not out of hesitation, but because leaving now would feel incomplete, like walking away from a problem just as it began to make sense. He reached into his jacket again, pulling out the folded napkin, smoothing it carefully against the table beside him, not to revisit the answer, but to study the structure one more time. And this time he saw more than the flaw. He saw the assumption that created it. The silent belief that the problem had been presented correctly, that the frame itself did not need questioning, and that realization extended beyond the napkin. It echoed into everything else, into the way he evaluated people, situations, even opportunities. He had always trusted the frame, because he was often the one who built it. But what if the frame was the first thing that needed to be challenged? His eyes lifted again, finding Emily near the service station. She was finishing her shift. He could tell not by any announcement, but by the way her movements changed, slightly slower, more contained, as if she was closing a loop rather than continuing it. She removed her apron, folded it neatly, placed it in the designated space, every action deliberate, nothing wasted. Daniel stepped forward once more, not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to meet her before she disappeared into the back. She noticed him. Of course, she always did, but this time there was something different in her gaze, not curiosity, not resistance, just acknowledgement, as if she already knew why he had come back. "You stayed," she said quietly. And it was not a question. Daniel nodded. "I had something to understand," he replied. And this time, the words felt accurate, not strategic. Emily leaned lightly against the counter, her posture relaxed. "And did you?" she asked. Daniel glanced briefly at the napkin in his hand, then back at her. "Part of it," he admitted. "The rest is not on paper." Emily gave a small nod, as if confirming something she already knew. Silence followed. Not awkward, not heavy, just present. And in that silence, Daniel realized something else, something that had been there all along. She had never tried to teach him, never tried to prove anything. She had simply acted, and the understanding came from observing that, not from being told. "You saw something I did not," he said, more clearly now. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering. "I saw what was there," she replied. "You were looking for something else, and that difference between seeing what is there and searching for what is expected settled deeply, because it applied to more than just a moment. It applied to how he had approached nearly everything. He looked around the room one last time, not as an owner of the space, but as someone passing through it, noticing the small details he would have ignored before. Then his gaze returned to her, steady, grounded. "What would you have done?" he asked, "if I had not asked the question." Emily did not answer immediately. She thought about it, just for a second, then gave a quiet response. "The same thing," she said, and that was the final shift, the one that completed the pattern, because it meant none of this depended on him. Not the answer, not the action, not the clarity. It existed independently, and that realization removed the last piece of control he thought he had. But instead of resisting it, he accepted it, not as a loss, but as an expansion of something he had not considered before. He folded the napkin again, slower this time, more carefully, then placed it back into his jacket, not as a challenge, not as a reminder of a game, but as a marker of perspective, something he would carry beyond this room, beyond this moment. Because what had changed was not the outcome of a question, but the way he would approach the next one. And as Emily turned toward the back exit, her shift complete, her presence fading from the room without effort, Daniel remained still for a moment longer, not trying to follow, not trying to stop her, just standing in the quiet space she left behind, understanding now that some answers were not meant to be held, but to be learned from. And that was a different kind of value entirely. The door closed softly behind her, not loud enough for anyone else to notice, but Daniel did. He felt it more than heard it. The quiet end of something that had not begun the way most things in his life did. No announcement, no negotiation, no clear exchange, just a shift that left everything slightly different than before. He remained standing for a moment, then turned back toward the room, but it no longer felt the same. The lights were still warm, the tables still filled, the conversation still flowing, yet something had changed in how he saw it, or perhaps in how he chose to see it. He walked slowly to his table, now empty, the glasses cleared, the surface reset as if nothing had happened. But he knew better. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the napkin once more, unfolding it carefully, not to revisit the answer, but to remember the moment he realized he had been asking the wrong question. He placed it flat on the table, his eyes tracing the lines, not searching, just observing, and for the first time, there was no urgency in it, no need to solve, only the recognition that understanding did not always arrive with effort. Sometimes it arrived when you stopped forcing it. He sat down, his posture relaxed, his watch catching the light as his wrist rested against the table, the ticking steady, consistent, unchanged, and yet it sounded different now, not as a measure of time, but as a reminder of how often he had rushed past things that required stillness. A server approached quietly, asking if he needed anything else, and Daniel paused, considering the question in a way he had not before, then gave a small shake of his head. "No," he said, his voice calm. "I think I have enough." The server nodded and stepped away, leaving him alone with the silence. And this time he did not fill it. He allowed it to exist, to stretch, to settle, because within it he could feel the outline of something forming. Not a deal, not a strategy, but a shift in perspective, something less visible, but far more lasting. He folded the napkin again, slower than before, precise, deliberate, and slipped it back in his jacket, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of being challenged, but as a marker of a moment when he chose to see differently. He stood, adjusted his suit jacket, and glanced once toward the back of the restaurant, not expecting to see her, not needing to, because whatever he had needed to understand was already there, carried with him now. He walked toward the exit, each step steady, not hurried, not delayed, just present. And as he reached the door, he paused briefly, his hand resting against the handle, the world outside waiting, unchanged, and yet he knew he would not enter it the same way he had before, because the next time he faced a problem, a person, a decision, he would not begin with what he assumed to be true. He would begin by questioning the frame itself. And in that small shift, everything would be different. He stepped outside into the night air, the cool breeze steady against his face, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what he could control, but about what he had finally learned to see, because some lessons do not arrive with noise or victory. They arrive quietly, in moments most people overlook, and they stay, not because they demand attention, but because they change the way you give it.